The dust of Purgatory Creek settled on everything. A fine, gritty powder the color of rust and regret. It coated the warped timbers of the saloon, the dry trough outside the livery, and the soul of any man who stayed too long. Seth Callahan rode into town slow, his horse's hooves making soft thuds in the deep dust of the main street. He was not a man who hurried. The sun beat down on his worn hat. And his eyes, the color of a faded blue sky, scanned the squalid settlement with a practiced emptiness. He was not here for whiskey or women. He was here for a horse, a fine-boned mare with a white blaze on her nose. Stolen from him 3 months back on the trail from Santa Fe. He'd heard whispers the thief, a greasy man who dealt in stolen goods both animal and human, had last been seen heading for this blister on the Mexico-New Mexico border, a town run by the shadow of 2 men, a judge whose scales were weighted with gold, and a man named Otis Green, who owned the grandest building in town, a 2-story brothel and saloon called the Gilded Cage, where most of the town's real business was done. Justice in Purgatory Creek was a commodity, and Seth had learned long ago he could not afford the price, but a horse was a different matter. A man's horse was an extension of his own legs, his freedom. He would get her back. He tied his gelding to a hitching post, the leather of his reins creaking in the oppressive quiet of the afternoon. The town seemed to hold its breath under the heat. A few listless figures watched him from the shade of a cantina porch, their eyes narrowed and suspicious. Strangers were either trouble or a source of income, and Seth looked like he could be both. A noise drew his attention from the end of the street, a low murmur of voices that grew into a coarse rumble of laughter and shouted bids. It came from the public square, a patch of sun-baked dirt between the blacksmith and the general store. Seth's jaw tightened. He knew what that sound meant in a town like this. He had seen it before, in other God-forsaken places where the law was just a word. He had always ridden on. It was not his fight. He had learned the hard way that fighting other people's battles only left you with more graves to dig. But his feet moved of their own accord, carrying him toward the gathering crowd. He moved with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, a souvenir from a bullet that had shattered more than just his thigh bone years ago. He pushed through a throng of sweat-stained ranchers, leering prospectors, and off-duty soldiers. In the center of the circle, on a low wooden platform, stood the reason for the commotion. There were 3 of them. Women, shackled at the ankles, their heads bowed. The auctioneer, a fat man with a stained waistcoat and a booming voice, was extolling the virtues of the first, a pale girl with straw-colored hair who could not stop trembling. Seth's face remained a mask of stone, his expression unreadable. He'd seen this ugliness before. He'd seen men barter for a human life with less care than they'd use to buy a mule. He felt the familiar cold knot form in his gut, a feeling he had carried for so long it had become a part of him. He told himself he was only watching, only passing through. He was here for his horse. Nothing more. Then the auctioneer pushed the second girl forward. She was different. She was not trembling, nor was she weeping. She stood perfectly still, her small frame held with a rigid dignity that seemed to mock the filth and degradation around her. She wore a simple skirt, the color of faded blood, torn near the hem. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, and a purple bruise bloomed on her cheekbone, but her face was turned slightly away, her eyes fixed on a spot in the dust just beyond the platform. She was no more than 22, her skin browned by a sun that had not been kind. The ropes that had bound her had left angry red welts on her wrists, raw and broken. She did not plead with her eyes. She did not beg for mercy. She simply endured, her silence a fortress against the grunts and jeers of the men. Seth felt something shift inside him, a crack in the ice that had encased his heart for years. He saw not just a victim, but a flicker of defiance in the straight line of her back. He saw a soul that refused to be broken, even as her body was being sold. "Now this one," the auctioneer bellowed, grabbing her arm and forcing her to face the crowd. "A real prize, fresh from the south, with fire in her blood. Strong back for work, and pretty enough for a Sunday. Who'll start the bidding for this little desert flower?" A drunken rancher with a stained beard yelled, "$20! "I see 20. A paltry sum for such a fine specimen," the auctioneer boomed. An ex-soldier with a cold, dead look in his eyes raised a finger. 25. Even a preacher, a man with a Bible tucked under his arm and piety dripping from his tongue, offered a bid, $30, for the purpose of saving her immortal soul. Of course, the crowd snickered. The bids climbed, each one a fresh layer of filth upon the girl's silent dignity. Seth stood motionless, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. He felt the old rage rising, the black tide that he had fought to keep down for 10 long years. He saw the girl flinch as the rancher who'd made the first bid stepped closer, his eyes roaming over her as if she were a piece of livestock. The final bid was settling at $50, a fortune for a man to spend on anything, let alone a person. The auctioneer's hammer was about to fall. Before it could, Seth moved. He did not shout. He did not draw his weapon. He simply stepped through the parting crowd, his boots silent in the dust. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the auctioneer's table. It landed with a solid, definitive thud, the unmistakable sound of gold coin. The crowd fell silent. Every eye turned to him. The auctioneer stared at the pouch, then at the stranger's cold, unyielding face. Seth's voice was low, raspy from disuse, but it carried across the square with the finality of a gunshot. "She's mine now." He did not wait for a response. He stepped onto the platform, the wood groaning under his weight. The girl finally looked up, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. He ignored the auctioneer's sputtering protests. He ignored the angry glare from the rancher. Using a knife from his belt, he sliced through the rope that bound her hands, his movements quick and efficient. Then, without a word, he scooped her up into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed. Her body was rigid with shock. He turned and walked away. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, the men shuffling back, their bluster dissolving in the face of his silent, absolute certainty. No one challenged him. No one dared. There was something in the way he moved, in the cold fire in his eyes, that promised a swift and terrible violence to any who stood in his way. He walked back to his horse, set the girl down on her feet, and untied the reins. He did not ask her name. He did not offer his. He simply swung himself into the saddle, then reached down and pulled her up to sit behind him. Her hands hesitated, then clutched at his belt for balance. He spurred the gelding and rode out of Purgatory Creek, leaving the pouch of gold, the stunned silence, and the stolen mare behind. He knew as he rode that he had just traded his past for a future he did not want and could not comprehend. The sun began to dip toward the jagged horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. They rode in silence. The girl behind him was a stiff, silent weight. He could feel her trembling, but she made no sound. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, the muscles in his back tense, acutely aware of her presence. This was a complication he did not need, a responsibility he had not sought. He had acted on an impulse he did not understand, a ghost of the man he used to be. When darkness fell, he finally stopped. He built a small fire, its flames pushing back the immense, lonely dark of the desert. He pulled a strip of jerky and a canteen from his saddlebag and handed them to her. She took them, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. Her hands were small and cold. He watched her eat, her movements slow and deliberate. She ate like a starving animal, but with a strange, careful grace. He looked away, turning his gaze to the fire. He did not speak. Words were useless things, clumsy and false. They could not explain the hollowed-out space inside him, nor could they comfort the terror he knew she must be feeling. So he stayed silent. Later, when the desert air grew sharp with cold, he took off his heavy canvas coat and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at his closeness, but did not pull away. He settled on the other side of the fire, pulling his saddle over for a pillow, his gun resting on his thigh. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, the memories did, as they always did in the quiet of the night. The firelight flickered, and for a moment, it was not a stranger huddled in his coat, but Eleanor. He remembered the cool autumn night, a sky littered with stars so bright they looked like chips of ice. He and Eleanor were sitting by a fire just like this one, outside the small cabin they had built with their own hands. Her laugh was the warmest sound he had ever known. She was wearing his coat, huddled inside it, her head resting on his shoulder. They had been talking about the future, about the children they would have, the small herd of cattle they would raise. Life had felt simple then, a straight and open road. "I'll always keep you safe, Eleanor," he had whispered, his voice thick with a love so fierce it felt like an ache in his chest. "I know," she had answered, her faith in him as solid and real as the ground beneath them. The memory soured, as it always did. The straight road had ended in a cliff. The scent of pinewood smoke was replaced by the acrid smell of burning timber. The sound of her laughter was drowned out by the screams of men and the crack of rifles. Comancheros. They had swept down on their small ranch at dusk, a whirlwind of chaos and violence. He had fought. He had killed 2 of them before a bullet tore through his leg, sending him down into the dirt. He had tried to crawl to the cabin, to her, but he was too slow. He had seen them drag her out, her face a mask of terror. He had heard her scream his name. He had woken up hours later, the fire nothing but embers, the silence deafening. He found her near the burnt shell of their home. She was lying in the dust, as still as the stars above, the life gone from her eyes. He had held her cold body until the sun came up, and a part of him had died with her. The man who believed in straight roads, in the future, in the power of a promise to keep someone safe. That man was gone. In his place was someone quieter, harder, someone who understood that justice was a lie and safety was an illusion. Since that day, he had kept to himself, a ghost drifting through the territories, taking work where he could find it, trusting no one, and fighting only when he had no other choice. He had seen suffering and looked away, because to engage was to remember the one time he had failed to protect the only person who mattered. Until today, he had not looked away. He had stepped in, and he did not know why. They reached his homestead 2 days later. It was not much, just a small, sturdy cabin he had repaired himself, a lean-to barn, and a corral, all nestled in a shallow canyon that offered shelter from the wind and prying eyes. It was miles from any town, a place chosen for its isolation. He dismounted and helped the girl down. Her legs were stiff, and she stumbled. He caught her arm to steady her, and she pulled away as if burned. He let his hand drop. "The cabin is yours," he said, his voice still rough. "There's food in the pantry, water in the barrel." He led his horse toward the barn without another glance at her. She stood there, a small, lost figure in the vast, empty landscape, his coat still clutched around her shoulders. She watched him go, her expression a mixture of confusion and wariness. He spent the rest of the day tending to his horse, checking his fences, busying himself with the familiar, mindless chores of survival. He did not go near the cabin. When night fell, he took a few blankets and made his bed in the hayloft of the barn. The smell of hay and leather was familiar, comforting. From a small opening in the loft, he could see the single window of the cabin. A faint yellow light appeared in it as she lit the lantern he had left on the table. He lay back, the straw rustling beneath him. He had brought her here, to his sanctuary. He had freed her from one cage only to put her in another, albeit a larger one. He had refused to touch her, had not even asked for her name. He was not those men in the town square. He would not be. He would not take what she had not offered. He would not even sleep under the same roof. He had bought her. Yes, but he would not own her, wood. Inside the cabin, Maria, a name she had not heard spoken with kindness in a very long time, slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the simple cot. The cabin was clean, sparse: a table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a small pantry with tins of beans and sacks of flour. It was more than she had had in months. She was alone. She was not chained. She walked to the door and touched the wooden latch. It was not locked. She could open it. She could walk out into the darkness and run. But where would she go? She turned and looked out the small window toward the barn. There was no light, only the dark, solid shape of it against the star-dusted sky. He was in there. The man with the unreadable eyes and the silent mouth. The man who had paid a fortune for her and then treated her as if she were made of glass. She did not understand him. He was a contradiction, a puzzle. He was gentle in his actions but cold in his demeanor. Over the next few days, she began to watch him. She saw the way he favored his left leg, the slight limp more pronounced when he thought no one was looking. She saw him spend an hour patiently removing a thorn from his horse's hoof, his voice a low, soothing rumble. One afternoon, she watched as he found a hawk with a broken wing near the creek bed. He did not kill it. He carefully splinted the wing with twigs and strips of leather, leaving a small bowl of water for the creature before leaving it in a sheltered spot. He never came into the cabin while she was there. He would leave firewood and fresh water on the porch in the early morning before she was awake. He never spoke to her unless absolutely necessary, and then only in short, clipped sentences. But he never, ever locked the door. Maria stood by the window, clutching the rough fabric of his coat. She was a prisoner here, but her jailer was a mystery. He had saved her from hell, but for what purpose? She did not know. For the first time in a long time, she felt something other than fear. It was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling. It was confusion, and buried deep beneath it, a tiny, flickering ember of curiosity. She wanted to know who Seth Callahan was. The days bled into one another, measured not by a calendar, but by the sun's slow journey across the vast, indifferent sky. A fragile, unspoken rhythm established itself on the homestead. Maria would rise with the first gray light, her nights often fractured by shadows that chased her even in sleep. The cabin was her world, a small box of quiet safety. But the ghosts of her past were not so easily contained. A sudden noise, the sharp crack of a log settling in the fire, the distant cry of a hawk, would make her flinch, her body coiling tight as a spring, her heart hammering against her ribs. She began to help, tentatively at first. She swept the cabin's floor, patched a small hole in one of Seth's shirts with thread she found in a tin, and tended the small, struggling herb garden near the door. These were small acts of existence, whispers against the screaming silence of her memory. She found she could not look at her own reflection. There was a small, cracked piece of mirror nailed to the wall by the wash basin, and she avoided it as if it were a curse. To see her own eyes was to see the fear in them, to see the face that men had looked upon with such casual cruelty. She did not want to see that person. She did not know who she was without that fear. Seth remained a creature of the outside, as stoic and weathered as the landscape itself. He was a silent observer, his presence a constant, watchful weight. He noticed the way she startled at loud noises, the way she never looked in the mirror. He said nothing, but his actions spoke a language she was slowly beginning to learn. One morning, she found the cabin door, which had always creaked on its hinges, moved with a smooth, silent swing. He had rehung it, reinforcing the frame. A few days later, 2 simple curtains made from clean flour sacks appeared on the porch. They were rough and plain, but they covered the window, offering a sense of privacy she had not known in a year. When the mornings grew colder, his heavy canvas coat was always there, left on a peg by the door, a silent offering against the chill. He never asked for it back. He never asked about her past. He never spoke of the bruises that were slowly fading from her skin or the haunted look in her eyes. And she, in turn, did not ask about the limp he tried to hide, or the way he would sometimes stare off at the horizon, his face a mask of such profound loneliness. It made her ache. Their silence was a strange sort of pact, a shared space where the horrors of their pasts could exist without being named. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple gray, and the clouds rolled in from the mountains, thick and heavy. The first clap of thunder was a violent crack that seemed to split the world in two. Maria cried out, a small, sharp sound, and scrambled into the farthest corner of the cabin, pulling a blanket over her head. The storm raged, each peal of thunder a gunshot, each flash of lightning the stark, terrifying light of a lantern in a dark room where she was not alone. She did not know how long she huddled there, shivering, her eyes squeezed shut. She did not hear the cabin door open over the howl of the wind. She only knew that the air around her slowly began to warm. A soft, flickering orange light pushed at the edges of the blanket. She dared to peek out. Seth was there. He was not looking at her. He was kneeling by the stone fireplace, tending to a small, new fire. He had not spoken, had not approached her corner. After the fire was crackling steadily, he moved one of the wooden chairs to the center of the room, a careful distance from her, and sat down. He pulled a knife and a piece of wood from his pocket and began to whittle, his hand steady and sure. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He simply sat there, a solid, silent presence, a bulwark against the storm's fury. He waited, and as the thunder slowly rumbled away into the distance, Maria's shivering began to subside. She began to wonder about him, about the deep puzzle of his nature. She had known men her whole life. She knew their appetites, their casual cruelties, the way their desires could blot out a woman's very existence. Most men, having paid what he paid, would have taken her that first night, their ownership a thing to be proven on her body. But Seth did not want her body. He seemed to want nothing from her at all. It was a terrifying and confusing kindness. She tried to understand it, to find the angle, the trick. Was it pity, or was she so broken, so undesirable, that even he could not bring himself to touch her? One evening, driven by a desperate need to understand, to provoke a reaction that made sense in the world she knew, she decided to test him. He was cleaning his rifle on the porch as she prepared for sleep. She stood in the open doorway of the cabin, the lantern light behind her casting her in silhouette. Slowly, deliberately, she began to unbutton her dress, her eyes fixed on him. She saw his hands still, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. She let the dress slip from her shoulders, pooling at her feet, leaving her standing in her thin chemise. It was a desperate, reckless act, an invitation and a challenge. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, with a low sound that might have been a curse, he turned his head away. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He stared out into the darkness, his shoulders rigid. "Get inside, Maria," he said, his voice a low, strained rasp. It was the first time he had used her name, a name he must have overheard in the town square. "And cover yourself. You'll catch a chill." He did not look back, shaking with a mixture of shame and a strange, unfamiliar relief. She fumbled for her dress and hurried back into the cabin, pulling the door shut behind her. He did not want her. Not like that. The realization was both a comfort and a deep, unsettling mystery. Slowly, tentatively, the first green shoots of trust began to push through the barren soil of her fear. She began to see his silence not as coldness, but as a form of respect. He was giving her space to heal, space to breathe. He was letting her decide the shape of her own days. One afternoon, she found a small stash of dried corn and, using the hearth, managed to grind it into a coarse meal. She cooked a simple stew with some salted pork from the pantry and the cornmeal cakes. It was not much, but it was a meal she had made with her own hands. When Seth came in from the barn at dusk, He stopped in the doorway, the aroma filling the small space. He looked at the table, where 2 plates were set, then at her. His expression was, as always, unreadable. He washed his hands at the basin, his back to her, and sat down. They ate in their usual silence, but this silence felt different. It was not empty, it was shared. The stew was hot, and the corn cakes were a little burnt, but he ate every bite. When only 1 cake was left on the platter between them, he picked it up, broke it in 2, and pushed the larger half across the table to her. She looked from the bread to his face. His eyes met hers for just a second, and in them, she saw not pity, but a simple, straightforward acknowledgement. He was sharing with her, as equals, and for the first time since she had been dragged from her family's rancho. A genuine smile touched Maria's lips. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was real. A few days later, he began to teach her. It started with the horse. He showed her how to saddle his gelding, how to hold the reins, how to sit tall and move with the animal's rhythm. He was a patient teacher, his instructions sparse and practical. Heels down. Look where you're going, not at the horse. She learned quickly, the fear of the powerful animal beneath her slowly giving way to a thrilling sense of freedom. Then came the rifle. It was heavy and awkward in her hands, and the first time she fired it, the recoil sent her stumbling backward, her shoulder aching. But Seth just calmly picked it up and showed her again how to brace it, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger instead of yanking it. Don't be afraid of it, he told her, his voice low. Respect it. It's a tool. Nothing more. She practiced until her arms trembled with fatigue, but a fierce determination burned in her. She would never be weak again. She would never be helpless. He taught her how to chop wood, how to swing the axe so its own weight did the work. He showed her how to read the tracks of animals in the dust by the creek, how to find north by the stars. Each lesson was a small piece of independence, a tool to build a new life with. In teaching her how to survive in his world, he was giving her back a piece of her own. One evening, as they sat by the fire outside the cabin, the crickets chirping in the tall grass, she found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her for weeks. "Do you regret buying me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face. When he finally answered, his voice was low and certain. "I didn't buy you," he said, turning his head to look at her. His gaze was direct, unwavering. "I stopped them from touching you." The words settled over her, profound and absolute. He had not seen her as property, as a thing to be acquired. He had seen her as a person to be protected. In that moment, the last of the chains that had bound her in her own mind seemed to fall away, turning to dust in the cool night air. After that night, the silence between them began to fill with words. They were brief stories, fragments of lives offered up like precious, fragile gifts. Maria told him about her father's rancho in Mexico, about the horses she had loved, about the way the sun felt on her face in the mornings. She told him how, after her father died, her uncle, a man with a cruel mouth and greedy eyes, had sold her to a trader to pay off his gambling debts. She spoke of running, of being caught, of the 2 other men who had owned her before she ended up on that platform in Purgatory Creek. She told the story in a flat, emotionless voice, as if it had all happened to someone else. Seth listened, his face impassive, but she saw the way his hand tightened into a fist when she spoke of her uncle. In return, he offered up small pieces of himself. He never spoke of Eleanor, never spoke of the raid, but he told her about growing up in Ohio, about his belief as a young man, that the world was a just place, that good deeds were rewarded and evil was punished. "I used to believe in the law," he admitted one night, his voice laced with a weary bitterness. "I used to believe in justice. Now I just believe in doing the right thing in front of you, even if it does not make a lick of difference in the end." Their connection, forged in silence and survival, began to deepen into something more. It was a bond of shared wounds, of a mutual understanding of the world's casual brutality, and it was cemented the day she saw him cry. He had ridden into town for supplies, a trip he made only when absolutely necessary. He had been gone all day, and Maria had felt a strange, hollow anxiety in his absence. When he returned at dusk, he was different. The usual wall of stoic control had cracks in it. He unsaddled his horse with a rough, jerky motion and walked past the cabin without a word, heading for the creek that ran along the edge of the property. Curiosity and a flicker of worry made her follow him. She found him sitting on a large, flat rock by the water's edge, his back to her. His shoulders were shaking, just slightly. As she drew closer, she could hear the sound, a rough, choked sob he was trying to smother. He was weeping, silently, desperately, as if a dam inside him had finally broken. She stopped, her heart clenching in her chest. She did not know what to do. The man who had been her rock, her silent protector, was as broken as she was. He had not seen a rider in town who resembled someone from his past. It was the simple, ordinary sight of a family, a man lifting his laughing, red-haired daughter onto his shoulders, that had undone him. It was a vision of a life he had lost, a future that had been stolen from him. Maria did not go to him. She did not touch him or offer words of comfort she did not have. Instead, she remembered the thunderstorm. She remembered what he had done for her. She walked back to the homestead, her heart heavy, and gave him the one thing she knew he needed. She gave him his silence. She gave him his space. She understood, and in that shared, unspoken understanding of grief, their two lonely souls drew a little closer together. A quiet man's actions, like a stone dropped in a still pond, create ripples that travel farther than he intends. Seth's defiant purchase in the dusty square of Purgatory Creek was such a stone. Word traveled on the hot, dry wind, carried by mule skinners and prospectors, whispered over warm beer in the saloon. The story grew with each telling. Some said the stranger had killed the auctioneer. Others said he was a lawman, or a devil. But they all agreed on one thing. He had taken a girl marked as the property of Otis Green, and Otis Green was not a man who tolerated theft. Green, sitting in his plush office above the gilded cage, heard the stories, and his face, usually a bland mask of professional cordiality, tightened. It was not about the girl. She was replaceable, a piece of inventory. It was about the principle. It was about the message. If any man could ride into town and simply take what was his, then his entire enterprise, built on fear and control, would crumble. He sent 2 men, hard cases with calloused hands and empty eyes, to retrieve his property. He gave them simple instructions: bring the girl back and leave the man in the dirt. The men rode out to Seth's homestead full of whiskey and confidence. They returned before sunset, not with the girl, but with a shared horse, bruised faces, and a story they told in low, humiliated tones. They had found the place easily enough, but the man had been waiting. He had not been surprised. He had moved with a quiet, deadly efficiency that spoke of a past they had no desire to challenge again. One of them had a broken arm, the other, a deep gash over his eye from the butt of a rifle. They had been sent back as a message of their own. Seth watched them go from the ridge above his cabin, his rifle cool and heavy in his hands. He felt no triumph, only the cold, familiar certainty of what was to come. Green would not let this stand. This was just the beginning. He spent the next few days in a state of quiet, focused preparation. He checked the sight lines from the cabin to the surrounding canyon walls. He spent an afternoon reinforcing the cabin's door and window shutters with iron bars he had salvaged from an old mine. He cleaned and oiled his weapons, the Colt, the rifle, the shotgun, with a methodical calm that was more unnerving than any show of anger. He walked the perimeter of his land, his limp more pronounced, not setting elaborate traps, but simply noting the places where a man might take cover, the natural choke points, the loose rock that might betray a careless footstep. He found Maria watching him, her dark eyes wide with a fear he recognized. He walked over to where she stood by the woodpile. "You are not to go into town," he said. It was not a request. "You are not to go anywhere near it. If you see riders, you get inside the cabin and you bar the door." She looked at him, her chin lifting with a spark of the defiance he had first seen on the auction block. "And what will you do?" "What is necessary," he answered, his voice flat. "I can help," she insisted. "I am not a child. I am not a parcel to be hidden away while you fight." He looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the trembling girl from the town square, but the woman who had learned to fire a rifle, who had met his eyes across a dinner table and smiled. He saw her pride, the fierce, desperate need to have some control over her own fate. He had been trying to protect her, but he realized that in doing so, he was denying her the very strength he had been trying to foster. He nodded slowly. "All right." He walked into the barn and returned a moment later. He held out his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was a small, plain knife with a well-worn wooden handle. "The rifle is for distance. A shotgun is for a doorway. This," he said, his voice low, "is for when they are close enough to touch you. It is not for fighting. It is for finishing." He taught her how to hold it, how to use her body's weight behind a thrust. He showed her the places on a man's body where a blade could do the most damage with the least resistance. The lesson was grim and silent, a brutal education in the world's dark realities. She learned with a grim focus, her face pale but her hand steady. He was not just giving her a weapon, he was giving her a choice, and in a life that had been stripped of all choices, it was the most valuable gift he could offer. The attack came on a moonless night. The only light was the cold, distant glitter of the stars. Seth was not asleep. He was sitting in the darkness of the porch, a blanket around his shoulders, the shotgun resting across his lap. He had known they would come. He had felt it in the unnatural quiet of the canyon, in the way the air seemed to hold its breath. The first sound was the faintest snap of a twig from the direction of the creek bed. It was a sound no nocturnal animal would have made. He rose silently and slipped inside the cabin, bolting the door behind him. Maria was already awake, sitting bolt upright on her cot, the small knife clutched in her hand. He did not light the lantern. He moved to the window, peering through a small crack in the shutter. 3 shadows were moving through the darkness, low and fast, spreading out to approach the cabin from different sides. Bounty hunters, he guessed. Men who worked for coin and cared little for the why of their work. The night exploded. A bullet splintered the wood of the door, and Seth fired the shotgun in response, the roar of it deafening in the small space. A scream from the darkness told him he had found his mark. He dropped the shotgun, grabbing his rifle as another bullet punched through the window shutter, whining past his head. He fired back, aiming not at a man but at the flash of gunpowder he had seen. A grunt, a thud, and then silence from that direction. He moved to the other side of the cabin, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. The third man was smarter, circling around toward the back. Seth knew the cabin's weak point was the small, shutterless window in the rear wall. He was halfway there when the man's shape appeared in the opening, a pistol raised. Seth fired the rifle from his hip, a desperate, unaimed shot. The man fired at the same time. Seth felt a blinding, white-hot pain sear across his ribs. It was like being kicked by a horse. The impact threw him back against the wall, the rifle clattering to the floor. He slid down, his breath knocked out of him, a warm, wet stickiness spreading across his side. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard the third man fall back outside the window, and then there was silence. A deep, profound silence broken only by the ragged sound of his own breathing and the frantic chirping of crickets, resuming their song as if nothing had happened. He lay there for a long moment, the darkness of the cabin threatening to swallow him. Then, a small, hesitant movement. "Maria." She crept toward him, a ghost in her white chemise. "Are you hurt?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He could not answer. He could only manage a grim nod. His hand pressed against the wound in his side. She knelt beside him, her hands fluttering uncertainly. She saw the dark stain spreading on his shirt. Without a word, she turned and lit the lantern. The small flame chased the shadows away, revealing the chaos of the room and the blood on his shirt. Her face was stark white in the lantern light, but her eyes were clear and focused. The fear was there, but something else was there too, the same fierce determination he had seen in her when she practiced with the knife. She left his side and returned a moment later with the water bucket and some clean rags. She also carried a dress, a simple cotton one she had worn since her arrival. With a decisive rip, she tore a long strip from the hem. She gently pushed his hand away from the wound. Her touch was hesitant at first, then grew firmer. He gritted his teeth as she cleaned the wound. The bullet had torn a shallow furrow along his ribs, painful, bloody, but not fatal. She worked with a quiet efficiency, her movements deft and sure. She had done this before. He realized. She wrapped the strip of cloth from her dress tightly around his ribs, creating a pressure bandage. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her dark hair falling across her face. As she tied the final knot, her work finished. She looked up and met his eyes. She was so close he could see the flicker of the lantern flame reflected in her dark pupils. He could smell the faint, clean scent of soap from her skin. In that moment, she was not a victim he had rescued. She was not a responsibility he had taken on. She was just Maria, and she had saved him. Slowly, fighting the pain in his side, he raised his hand. It was the hand of a killer, calloused and scarred, but his touch was impossibly gentle as he brushed the stray hair from her cheek. It was the first time he had ever touched her with tenderness. Her breath hitched and her eyes widened. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her skin warm against his rough fingers. A torrent of unspoken words hung in the silent, lantern-lit air between them. He thought of Eleanor, of his failure, of the violence that always seemed to find him. He looked at Maria, at the strength and resilience in her face, and a feeling he could not name, a fierce, protective ache, swelled in his chest. "I don't want to own you," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "I just want you to stay alive." A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She simply knelt there, her gaze locked with his. As the weight of his words settled over them, it was a confession, an absolution, a promise. In the days that followed, their fragile bond intensified, tempered in the fire of that violent night. He was weak from the blood loss, and she cared for him, changing his dressing, cooking for him, bringing him water. The roles were reversed. He was the one who was vulnerable, and she was the one who was strong. The first night after the attack, she had brought her blankets from the cot and made a bed on the floor next to where he lay. He had tried to protest, but he was too weak. "It is so you do not have to call out if you need something," she had said, her tone leaving no room for argument. But they both knew it was more than that. It was about safety. It was about not being alone in the dark, with the ghosts of the dead men just outside. He still did not touch her, even as she slept a few feet away. A wall of respect and restraint, more formidable than any physical barrier, remained between them. He would lie awake, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, the pain in his side a dull throb, and feel a sense of peace he had not known in 10 years. One evening, about a week after the raid, he was sitting on the edge of the cot, his strength slowly returning. Maria was sitting on a chair nearby, mending a tear in his shirt. The cabin was quiet, filled with a comfortable, domestic silence. She finished her work, bit off the thread, and folded the shirt. Then she stood up and walked over to him. She stood before him, her face serious in the low light. Before he could ask what was wrong, she leaned down and pressed her lips to his. Her kiss was soft, hesitant, and full of a question she did not know how to ask. It was a question about comfort, about connection, about whether two broken people could find a way to be whole together. For a heartbeat, he responded, his own loneliness and desire a powerful, rising tide. But then the guilt, the ghost of Eleanor, the raw, brutal memory of all he had lost, crashed over him. He pulled back, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders gently. Her face fell, confusion and hurt clouding her eyes. "Maria," he began, his voice rough with an agony she could not understand. He looked at her, at the hope and trust in her face, and he felt like a fraud. How could he offer her comfort when he was the reason danger had come to her door? How could he offer her a future when his past was a graveyard? "I can't," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I do not know if I can protect you. Not from the world, not from myself." He let her go and turned away, unable to bear the look on her face. He was a man shaped by violence. It clung to him like the dust of the trail, and he was terrified that it would one day consume her, too. The next morning, the space between them was filled with a new, raw tension. He rose early and went to the barn, needing the solitude of his chores. When he returned to the cabin for breakfast, Maria was not there. He assumed she had gone for a walk by the creek. On her cot, folded with a neat precision, was a patch of dark red fabric. He walked over to it. It was the skirt she'd been wearing the day he had bought her. The torn hem was gone, re-sewn with small, even stitches. The dirt and grime had been washed away, leaving the fabric a clean, deep crimson. He had found it discarded in a corner of the cabin days ago and had taken it, not knowing why. He had spent an afternoon by the creek, scrubbing it clean, and had asked her to mend it the day before, telling her it was a useful piece of cloth. But it had not been about the cloth. It had been about the memory. He had wanted to erase the stain of that day, to give her back something that had been hers in a moment of utter degradation, but to give it back to her clean, whole. He stood there for a long time, the repaired red skirt a silent testament to everything he could not say, a symbol of a past he wanted to heal and a future he was terrified to claim. The repaired red skirt lay folded at the foot of Maria's cot, a silent testament to a question that had been asked and a line that had been drawn. She did not wear it. Instead, she chose a plain, gray cotton dress, a garment meant to fade into the background. But there was no fading for them. Not anymore. The fragile peace of their homestead had been shattered, and the world was pressing in. Their supplies were running low, and Seth had debts to settle with the blacksmith for the iron he had used to reinforce their home. A trip to Purgatory Creek was unavoidable. They rode into town together, side by side on their horses, a sight that drew immediate and hostile attention. The air of quiet defiance they projected was an insult to the town's established order. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped their conversations on the boardwalks to stare, their expressions a mixture of contempt and a grudging, fearful respect. Whispers followed them like a trail of dust. "That's him," they muttered. "The one who took Green's girl." They did not see a man and a woman. They saw a thief and his stolen property. Seth's face was a granite mask, his eyes fixed forward. But Maria could feel the tension radiating from him. She held her head high, her back straight in the saddle, remembering the lessons he had taught her. "Look where you're going," he had said. She would not look down. She would not show them her fear. Their first stop was the general store. The proprietor, a balding man named Silas, had always been civil to Seth in the past. But today, his eyes darted nervously toward the door as they entered. Seth placed his list on the counter. Silas gathered the flour, salt, and coffee. But when Maria stepped forward to look at a bolt of blue cloth, the man's face soured. "We don't serve her kind here," Silas said, not looking at her, his voice low and tight. Seth went still. The friendly warmth of the store evaporated, replaced by a sudden, dangerous chill. She's with me, Seth said, his voice dangerously quiet. I can't. Seth, Silas stammered, wiping his sweaty palms on his apron. Mr. Green. He lets me run my business in peace. I can't afford no trouble. Maria felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She backed away from the counter, wanting to disappear. But Seth did not raise his voice. He simply gathered the few items Silas had already bagged, placed the correct coin on the counter, and turned to her. We'll find what we need elsewhere, he said, his eyes meeting hers for a brief second, offering a silent reassurance. He was not ashamed of her. He was angry for her. They walked out, leaving the blue cloth behind, the weight of the town's judgment heavy on their shoulders. As they were tying their supplies to their saddles, they came. 2 of them, walking out from the alley beside the saloon. They were Green's men, their arrogance fueled by cheap whiskey and the power of their employer. One of them, a big bearded man with cruel eyes, stepped directly into Maria's path. Well, look what we have here, the man sneered, his gaze crawling over her. Lost your way back to your rightful home. Have you? Maria tried to step around him, but he shot out a hand and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. Mister, Green is wondering when you're going to come pay your respects. He misses his investment. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. His touch was a nightmare made real, a visceral reminder of every man who had ever laid a hand on her without permission. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Seth's voice cut through the air, devoid of all emotion. Let her go. The man laughed, tightening his grip. Or what, Callahan? You gonna buy her from me too? You ain't got enough gold in the world. It happened faster than a blink. Seth's hand was a blur of motion. There was no shouted warning, no tense standoff. There was only the smooth, clean sound of his Colt clearing its holster and the deafening crack of a gunshot that echoed down the street. The man holding Maria screamed, a high, sharp sound of shock and pain, and stumbled backward. Clutching his leg where a dark hole had appeared in his trousers, he collapsed in the dust, howling. The street fell silent. People froze on the boardwalks. Faces stared from windows, eyes wide with shock. In the middle of the day, in the middle of the street, Seth Callahan stood over Green's man, his pistol still smoking, his face as calm and empty as a winter sky. He had not killed him. He had delivered a message, written in gunpowder and blood. He holstered his weapon, took Maria's arm gently, and helped her onto her horse. He swung into his own saddle and, without a backward glance at the wounded man or the stunned crowd, they rode toward the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a man named Elias Thorne, was older than Seth remembered. His face a roadmap of weariness, his badge a tarnished spot on his faded vest. He listened patiently as Seth recounted the incident, his expression sympathetic. I saw it from my window. Seth, Thorne said, sighing as he leaned back in his creaking chair. He grabbed the girl. You warned him. It was a clean shoot. Far as I'm concerned. I want to file a complaint, Seth said, for assault against Otis Green's man. The sheriff's eyes clouded over. He picked up a pen, rolled it between his fingers, and set it down again. You can file it, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, and I'll put it in my drawer with all the others. And that's where it'll stay. Seth, you have to understand, Otis Green owns this town. He pays my salary, indirectly. He puts food on the table of nearly everyone here. I am one man with one badge. I can't fight him. No one can. The words hung in the dusty air of the small office, a final confirmation of their isolation. The law was a ghost here. There was no help to be had. I understand, Seth said, his voice flat. He turned and walked out, Maria following close behind. The hope of justice, a faint ember he had not even realized he was still carrying, was finally extinguished. They rode out of town in silence. The promise of a fresh start farther north the only thing left to them. On the trail, As the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery colors, Seth finally spoke. "We'll leave," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Soon as my side is fully healed and we have enough provisions, we'll head north, to Oregon maybe. Find a piece of land no one wants. So far from men like Green, they'll forget we exist." He looked at her, and, for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond his grim resolve. It was a deep, weary desire for peace. "We'll start fresh," he promised. And in the face of all the ugliness, the simple words were a balm to her soul. But the homestead was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. The attacks continued, but they were different now. They were insidious, meant to wear them down, to remind them they were under siege. A fence would be cut in the night. A tool would go missing from the barn. A dead coyote would be left on their doorstep. They were living on a knife's edge. The quiet of the night a source of tension rather than peace. One night, Seth was down by the creek, checking a line he had set for fish. Maria was in the cabin, preparing their meager supper. A floorboard on the porch creaked. It was a sound she knew intimately, a sound different from Seth's measured tread. Her heart leapt into her throat. She blew out the lantern and grabbed the small knife from its hiding place beneath her cot. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. The door latch rattled softly. A man's shape appeared in the opening, a dark silhouette against the twilight. He was not one of the bounty hunters from before. He was lean and wiry, moving with a predatory silence. He took a step inside, his eyes scanning the dark room, expecting it to be empty. He did not see her until it was too late. She lunged from the shadows, fueled by a surge of pure, primal terror. This would not happen to her again. She would not be taken. She would not be touched. She drove the knife forward with all her strength, just as Seth had taught her. The man grunted, a sound of pained surprise. He stumbled back, his hands flying to his stomach. He was bigger than her, stronger, but her attack had been unexpected. He swiped at her, his fingers catching in her hair, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he would overpower her. But his strength was already failing. He staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then he collapsed, falling heavily to the cabin floor. Maria scrambled back, her body trembling uncontrollably. She stared at the still form on the floor, at the dark pool spreading out from beneath him on the wooden planks. The knife fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering loudly in the sudden, absolute silence. That was how Seth found her when he returned moments later, drawn by a premonition of wrongness. She was huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, rocking back and forth. Her eyes were fixed on the dead man, wide and unseeing. He took in the scene in an instant. The body, the knife, Maria's catatonic state. He knelt in front of her, his hands hovering, not wanting to startle her. "Maria," he said softly. She did not respond. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. She flinched violently and let out a choked, ragged sob. "I didn't want to," she whispered, the words torn from her throat. "He came in. I didn't want to do it." The tears came then, a flood of horror and grief and shock. She collapsed against him, her body shaking with violent tremors. "I didn't want to do it." Seth wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. He pulled her away from the sight of the body, rocking her gently as if she were a child. He let her cry, her sobs echoing the terrible, final truth of what she had done. He felt the weight of it, the innocence that had been stolen from her, not just by this act, but by a lifetime of cruelty that had led her to this moment. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, he held her at arm's length, forcing her to look at him. His face was grim, but his eyes were full of a fierce, unwavering certainty. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and firm. "You survived. He came in here to harm you, and you survived. That is all that matters. Do you hear me? You survived." He was not just comforting her. He was giving her an anchor in the storm of her trauma. He was reframing the terrible act not as a sin, but as a victory. It was the only truth that could save her from being consumed by what she had done. Later, after he had dealt with the body, dragging it far out into the canyons, he returned to find her sitting on the cot, staring into space. He cleaned the floor, erasing the last physical trace of the violence. But the stain on the silence of the cabin remained. That night, she did not make a bed on the floor. She simply laid down on her cot, and he laid down on his own blankets nearby. The space between them felt both a mile wide and no thicker than a breath. In the deep, dark hours before dawn, he heard her stir. He opened his eyes to see her standing beside him. "I am cold," she whispered, her voice a fragile, trembling thing. He knew it was not a cold that a blanket could fix. It was a cold that came from the soul, from the terror of being alone with what she had done. He lifted the edge of his blanket in a silent invitation. She hesitated for only a second before slipping in beside him, her body shivering against his. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Her skin was like ice. He held her, offering the simple, honest warmth of his body. There was no passion in the embrace, only a profound and desperate human need for comfort. But as she slowly warmed in his arms, something shifted. The trembling in her body was no longer just from cold and fear. It was something else, a deeper tremor of need. She turned in his arms to face him, her eyes luminous in the darkness. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the rough line of his jaw. It was a touch of discovery, of question. He did not pull away this time. The barriers of his own grief and guilt seemed insignificant in the face of her raw, immediate pain. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a symbol of his past failures, but as the woman beside him, a survivor, fierce and fragile all at once. Their romance, when it finally came, was as quiet and trembling as her hand on his cheek. It was a slow, gentle exploration in the darkness, a conversation spoken not with words, but with hesitant touches and soft breaths. It was not the fire of new love, but the warm, steady glow of two embers finding each other in the ashes. For Seth, it was a reawakening of a part of himself he thought had died with Eleanor. For Maria, it was something entirely new, for the first time in her life. She was with a man not as an object to be used, but as a person to be cherished. For the first time, she felt seen. The next evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the twilight sky. The tension of the previous days had been replaced by a quiet, fragile intimacy. Seth reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, something that glinted in the dying light. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished with age, hanging from a delicate chain. He pressed it into her hand. "This was my fiancé's," he said, his voice low and steady. He did not say Eleanor's name, but Maria knew who he meant. Her name was Eleanor. She was killed a long time ago. Maria looked at the locket, then at his face, her heart aching for the pain she saw in his eyes. She tried to give it back. "I cannot take this." "Yes, you can," he said, closing her fingers over it. He looked directly at her, his gaze clear and honest, sweeping away any shadow of the past that might lie between them. "I want you to have it, not because you remind me of her, because you do not. I want you to have it because you have seen nothing but ugliness for so long, and you deserve something beautiful." The silver locket was cool against Maria's skin, a small, solid weight beneath her dress. It was a promise of beauty, but beauty felt like a distant country. The world they inhabited now was one of ugly rumors and the constant, simmering threat of violence. Otis Green's response to the shooting in the street had been swift and public. He had not sent more men to the homestead. Instead, he had posted a notice in Purgatory Creek, a crudely printed sheet nailed to the saloon door and the notice board outside the sheriff's office. It offered $500 in gold for the capture of Seth Callahan, wanted for attempted murder. But it was the words whispered in the town's dusty corners that were the true poison. The story of the man Maria had killed in the cabin had twisted and grown into a monstrous new shape. She was no longer a woman who had defended herself. In the town's telling, she was a crazed killer, a venomous creature Seth was harboring. The bounty on his head was not just for his own actions. It was for the crime of protecting her. The world had shrunk to the size of their small patch of land, and the canyon walls seemed to press in closer each day. Maria saw the toll it was taking on Seth. He moved with a restless energy, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He slept in short, fitful bursts, his hand always near his gun. He was a wolf in a cage, and she knew, with a certainty that was a cold stone in her gut, that she was the one who had locked the door. The quiet intimacy they had found in the darkness of the cabin felt like a dream from another life. The reality was the glint of sun on a rifle barrel, the snap of a twig in the night. The conflict tore her in two. To stay was to endanger him, to keep him tethered to a fight that would eventually kill him. Every moment she remained, she was a liability, a weakness his enemies could exploit. The thought of leaving was a physical pain, a tearing away of the only safety and kindness she had ever known. But the thought of him dying because of her was an agony she could not bear. One afternoon, while Seth was checking the perimeter, she made her decision, her hands trembling. She began to pack a small bundle, a little food, a canteen of water, the knife he had given her. She would leave in the night. She would head north, as he had suggested. She would disappear, and in her absence, perhaps the bounty would be forgotten. Perhaps he could find peace. He found her standing by the cabin door, the small bundle in her hand, the setting sun casting a long, lonely shadow behind her. He did not have to ask. He saw it in her eyes, in the resolute, tragic set of her jaw. "Do not do this, Maria," he said, his voice low and strained. "They want you because of me," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "If I am gone, they will have no reason to hunt you." "You think my life would be worth living if I let you walk out into that wilderness alone?" he asked. Taking a step closer, the weariness on his face was profound. "The world is full of men like Green. You would not get 100 miles. "I have to try," she insisted, clutching the bundle to her chest. "I will not be the reason you die." He stopped in front of her, his presence overwhelming, his gaze intense. "Listen to me. If something happens to me, if they come and I cannot stop them, I want you to run. You take my horse, you ride north, and you do not look back. That is the plan. But you do not run before the fight. You do not leave me to face it alone." The thought of him facing them alone, of her riding away while he fought for her, was a vision of hell. She looked at him, at the stubborn line of his jaw, at the deep pain in his eyes, and she understood. For him, protecting her was the last honorable thing in a world that had stripped him of everything else. To take that from him would be to break him in a way no bullet ever could. "No," she said, her voice finding a new, unshakable strength. She let the bundle fall to the dirt floor. "The plan has changed. If I leave you, they win. They take everything. We have come this far. We will finish it. Together." He stared at her, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of surprise, followed by a slow, dawning respect. She was no longer the frightened girl he had lifted from the platform. She was his partner. He gave a single, slow nod. The decision was made. They would not wait for the end to come to them. They would ride out and meet it. They rode for Purgatory Creek the next morning, not as fugitives, but as petitioners for a peace they knew they would likely have to win with blood. They did not go to the sheriff. They rode directly to the gilded cage, leaving their horses outside. They walked through the swinging doors of the saloon. The morning crowd of drinkers and gamblers fell silent, their eyes wide. Seth's hand rested on the butt of his Colt, but he made no move to draw it. He simply walked to the bar. "We are here to see Mr. Green," Seth said to the bartender. his voice calm and clear. Moments later, they were led up a carpeted staircase to Green's private office. It was a room of dark wood, red velvet, and the smell of expensive cigars. Otis Green sat behind a large mahogany desk, a man whose softness was more menacing than any brute's strength. He gestured for them to sit, a smile playing on his lips that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Callahan," Green said, his voice smooth as silk. "An unexpected pleasure, and you have brought my lost property with you. How thoughtful." "She is not your property," Seth said, his voice level. "She never was. We are here to end this. I have some money left, not much, but enough. I will give it to you. In exchange, you call off the bounty. You leave us be." Green leaned back in his chair, a look of genuine amusement on his face. He chuckled, a low, soft sound that was more insulting than a shout. "Money? You want to pay me for what is already mine? That is rich. You walk into my town, you take my merchandise, you shoot my employees, and you think you can settle the account with a few dollars?" "I am offering you a chance to avoid more trouble," Seth said, his hand still resting near his gun. Green's smile vanished. He leaned forward, his eyes turning to chips of ice. "Let me explain something to you. Callahan, this is my town, the people, the laws, the dust in the street. It is all mine. You think you can buy what is mine and call it freedom? You are a thief. And she," he said, his gaze shifting to Maria, "is a broken little thing who has forgotten her place. I believe a lesson is in order." He tapped a small bell on his desk. The door behind them burst open. 4 men, the same hard-faced thugs from the saloon, filled the doorway, their guns already drawn. "Kill them both," Green said with a sigh, as if ordering a drink. "And be neat about it. This is a new carpet." Seth moved before the words were fully out of Green's mouth. He kicked the heavy desk chair he was sitting in back into the nearest gunman, drew his Colt, and fired at the man beside him. The room erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire. Maria dove to the floor, pulling the small knife from her boot. A bullet splintered the wall where her head had been a second before. Green had overturned his massive desk for cover. Seth fired again, then ducked behind a velvet armchair as bullets tore through the upholstery. He was trapped, outnumbered. One of the gunmen was moving to flank him, to get a clear shot. Maria saw it. The man was focused on Seth, his back to her. Scrambling on her hands and knees, she moved with a speed born of desperation. She rose up behind him and drove her knife into the soft spot behind his knee. He roared in pain and surprise, his leg buckling. As he turned, his gun swinging toward her, a shot rang out. It was not from Seth's gun. It was from the pistol the man had dropped when Seth had first fired. Maria had snatched it from the floor. The gunman collapsed, a look of astonishment on his face. The distraction was all Seth needed. He fired twice, taking down the other 2 men. The sudden silence was shocking, ringing in their ears, thick with the smell of gunpowder. Green peeked over his desk, his face pale with rage. Seth fired a single shot that splintered the mahogany an inch from Green's head. "Stay down," Seth snarled. He grabbed Maria's hand. "Now!" They ran from the office, down the stairs, and into the saloon, where customers were hiding under tables. They burst out through the swinging doors into the sunlight and untied their horses in a frantic hurry. Shots rang out from the second-story window of the saloon as Green's other men recovered. A bullet tugged at Seth's sleeve as they leaped into their saddles and galloped out of town, leaving chaos in their wake. They did not head for the homestead. They knew it would be the first place Green would send a posse. Instead, they rode deep into the labyrinthine canyons west of town, a twisted maze of rock and sand where a man could lose himself for weeks. They rode hard for hours, pushing their horses until the animals were lathered with sweat and foam. As afternoon bled into evening, the sky turned a sickly yellow-brown. The wind began to howl, picking up sand and grit, stinging their eyes and blurring the horizon. A sandstorm. It was a stroke of luck, a curtain that would hide their tracks, but it was also a deadly peril in its own right. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The world became a swirling vortex of sand and wind. They were forced to dismount and lead their horses, stumbling blindly through the gale. Seth's side, where he had been shot weeks before, was aching with a deep, throbbing pain. The frantic ride had taken its toll. Just when it seemed they could go no further, they stumbled into the lee of a rock outcropping. There, half hidden by a rock slide, was a dark opening in the cliff face, the entrance to an abandoned mine. It was their only chance. They pushed their horses into the narrow opening and followed them into the cool, silent darkness. The roar of the sandstorm was instantly muffled to a distant, mournful howl. The mine shaft was their sanctuary, a tomb-like refuge from the storm and the men who were hunting them. Seth slid down the rock wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In the dim light filtering through the entrance, Maria could see that his face was pale, beaded with sweat. His hand was pressed to his side, and when he drew it away, his fingers were slick with fresh blood. The wound had reopened. He tried to stand, to protest, but his strength gave out. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the dusty floor of the mine, his body racked with exhaustion and pain. He was a man at the end of his rope. The unshakable strength she had always relied on finally stripped away. For a moment, Maria felt a surge of pure panic. He had always been the strong one, the protector. Now, he was helpless. But then, another feeling rose to replace the fear, a cold, clear resolve. He had taught her how to survive. Now, it was her turn. She knelt beside him, her hands surprisingly steady. "Do not move," she commanded, her voice firm. She tore another strip from her dress and, working by the faint light, cleaned and rebandaged his wound, pulling the cloth tight to stop the bleeding. She gave him the last of their water. He was shivering, his body shaking with a deep chill. She covered him with their saddle blankets, then sat beside him, her shotgun across her lap, watching the mine entrance as the storm raged outside. She was in charge now. When the storm passed the next morning, Seth was weak with fever. He could barely sit up, let alone ride. Maria knew they could not stay. Green's men would be scouring the canyons. She got him to his feet, her shoulder braced under his arm, and half carried him to his horse. Getting him into the saddle was a monumental effort that left them both trembling and breathless. She took the reins of his horse and began the long, slow journey back to their homestead, choosing a winding, difficult path that she hoped no posse would follow. She navigated by instinct, by the position of the sun, by the shape of the rock formations he had taught her to recognize. For 2 days, she led them through the wilderness, tending to his fever, giving him her share of their dwindling food, her mind sharp and focused, her body running on pure, unyielding will. When they finally saw the familiar shape of their canyon, she almost wept with relief. She got him inside the cabin and into his cot. For days, she nursed him, brewing teas from the herbs in her garden to fight the fever, keeping his wound clean. She was no longer his student. She was his protector, his guardian. She would watch him as he slept, the silver locket resting against her chest, a silent promise to a future she would fight for with every breath in her body. As the fever broke and Seth's strength began to return, a new understanding settled between them. They lay in the quiet of the cabin, the threat of Green a constant, unspoken presence beyond their door. They both knew the truth. Their plan to run north was a fantasy. There was no place they could go where Green's reach, or men like him, would not eventually find them. They could not run from this life. The only way to be free, truly free, was to turn and face the monster. They had to end the threat of Otis Green permanently. One evening, as he sat up for the first time, his back against the wall, she looked at him, her eyes clear and resolute. "Running will not work," she said. It was not a question. "No," he agreed, his voice still weak. It will not. Then we must finish it, she said. Here. He looked at her, at the formidable strength that had brought them home. He saw the mind behind her eyes, a mind that had been sharpened by hardship and fear. How? He asked. A slow, calculating light grew in her eyes. She thought of Green, of his arrogance, his love of money, his belief that everything could be bought and sold. His greatest strengths were also his greatest weaknesses. We use his own greed against him, Maria said, the idea taking shape as she spoke. We set a trap, and we lure him into it with the one thing he cannot resist, the chance to reclaim his property. The plan was born in the quiet desperation of the cabin, a dangerous gamble woven from Maria's cunning and Seth's knowledge of the land. It was a simple, elegant trap, baited with the two things Otis Green craved most, property and pride. The rumor they needed to plant had to be believable, a story that would appeal to Green's sense of superiority. They decided that Seth would be portrayed as a broken man, his spirit shattered by the relentless attacks, his wound festering, ready to cut his losses and run. To set the bait, Seth rode out to the main trail leading to Purgatory Creek. He did not go far, just enough to find what he was looking for, a lone prospector, his mule laden with picks and pans, his eyes full of the weary hunger of a man chasing a phantom fortune. Seth offered the man a gold coin, a small fortune for a day's work. The prospector's eyes widened. The task was simple. He was to go into Purgatory Creek, to the saloon, and spend the coin on whiskey. While drinking, he was to tell a story. He was to say he had stumbled upon Callahan's homestead and found the man in a bad way. He was to say Callahan's woman had been injured in the last raid, and that Callahan, defeated, was planning one final, desperate act. He was going to hold an auction of his own. He was going to sell the girl to the highest bidder at his barn in 3 days' time. At high noon, the money, the prospector was to say, was for a stake to disappear down into Mexico. The story was a masterpiece of misdirection. It painted Seth as a coward and a hypocrite, a man no different from the slavers he had supposedly defied. It was a narrative that Green would find irresistible. It would confirm his belief that all men were governed by greed and fear, and it offered him the chance for a spectacular public victory. He would not just reclaim his property, he would do it on the very ground where his authority had been challenged, turning Seth's homestead into a stage for his own triumph. For the next 2 days, Seth and Maria prepared. Their work was grim and methodical. They were not preparing for an auction. They were preparing for a war. They moved most of their supplies into the small cave behind the waterfall in the creek, a place that could serve as a fallback position. They spent hours on the ridges overlooking the barn, clearing lines of fire, building small, concealed breastworks of rock. Seth knew every inch of this land, every shadow, every echo. He placed them in positions where they could see the approach to the barn from 2 different angles, creating a deadly crossfire. The barn itself was the kill zone. The wide double doors were left slightly ajar, an invitation into a trap. On the 3rd day, a tense, electric silence fell over the homestead. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, baking the earth. High noon approached with an agonizing slowness. Maria was positioned on the eastern ridge, the rifle feeling cool and solid in her hands. She had a clear view of the trail. Seth was on the western ridge, a little closer to the barn, his shotgun and rifle laid out before him on a flat rock. They were connected by the vast, empty space between them, 2 solitary figures ready to make their stand. They came just as the sun reached its zenith. A plume of dust on the horizon announced their arrival. It was a larger group than Seth had expected. He counted 8 riders. Otis Green was in the lead, not on a workhorse, but on a fine black stallion, dressed in a tailored coat as if attending a Sunday social. He rode with the smug confidence of a king coming to collect a tribute. His men fanned out behind him, their guns drawn, their faces a mixture of arrogance and anticipation. They reined in their horses 50 yards from the barn. their eyes scanning the silent homestead. The stillness must have seemed suspicious, but Green's arrogance was a blinder. He saw an empty cabin, an open barn, and assumed his enemy was cowering inside, waiting to surrender. "Callahan!" Green's voice boomed across the canyon, startling a flock of crows from the cottonwoods. "Your time is up. Bring out my property, and I might be inclined to let you crawl away from here with your life." There was no answer but the whisper of the wind. Green chuckled, a sound of pure contempt. He motioned to 4 of his men. "Go in, bring her out. If he gives you any trouble, you know what to do." The 4 men dismounted and approached the barn on foot, their boots crunching on the dry ground. They moved with a swagger, rifles held loosely, expecting no resistance. They pushed open the heavy barn doors and stepped inside, their shapes momentarily silhouetted against the darkness within before they were swallowed by it. And then Seth gave the signal. It was not a shout, but the sharp, piercing whistle of a hawk. Maria had her sights on a gunman still on his horse. She took a steadying breath, just as Seth had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man jerked in his saddle and fell, a cloud of dust rising where he hit the ground. At the exact same moment, Seth's rifle cracked from the other ridge. Another rider tumbled from his horse. Panic erupted. The remaining 2 horsemen, caught completely in the open, fumbled for their weapons before they could fire a shot. Seth's shotgun roared, a blast of buckshot that swept one of them from the saddle. Green, his face a mask of shock and fury, spurred his horse toward the cover of a rocky outcropping, bellowing at his men. The 4 who had gone into the barn came rushing back out, blinking in the bright sunlight, their guns firing wildly and inaccurately at the unseen shooters on the ridges. Seth and Maria fired again, their shots echoing in a deadly rhythm across the canyon. One of the men from the barn fell, then another. They were trapped, caught in a crossfire with no cover. The fight was over in less than a minute. The swaggering enforcers were reduced to still, silent shapes in the dust. Only 2 were left: Otis Green, hiding behind the rocks, and one of his men, who had thrown down his gun and raised his hands in surrender. "It is over! Green!" Seth's voice called out, hard as the rock around them. "Come out, or the next one is for you!" For a long moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, Otis Green emerged from behind the rocks, his hands raised, his fine coat stained with dust. The look on his face was not fear, but a venomous, bottomless hatred. His pride, the very foundation of his power, had been shattered. Seth and Maria came down from the ridges, their rifles still trained on him. Seth collected the remaining weapons, his movements economical and sure. He bound Green's hands with a length of rope, the captured gunman. Seeing the cold, deadly efficiency of the man he had come to kill, was pale and trembling. Seth did not kill Green. That was not the plan. He put Green on his own horse, tied his feet beneath the animal's belly, and handed the reins to Maria. He looked at the surviving gunman. "You will tell the sheriff what happened here. You will tell him Otis Green rode out to murder a man and a woman in cold blood. You will tell him where to find the bodies. Now ride." The man, wild-eyed with terror and relief, scrambled onto a horse and galloped away toward town. Then, Seth, with Maria at his side leading the captured and humiliated Otis Green, began the long, slow ride back to Purgatory Creek. They arrived in the late afternoon. The gunman had done his work. The whole town seemed to be waiting. People spilled out of the saloons and stores, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. They saw the bodies of Green's men slung over their horses. They saw Green himself, the untouchable king of Purgatory Creek, bound and helpless, led by the very woman he had claimed as property. Seth rode directly to the center of the town square, to the very spot where Maria had stood on the auction block. He stopped there, creating a silent, waiting circle of stunned townspeople. Sheriff Thorne pushed through the crowd, his face grim, his hand resting on his pistol. "What is the meaning of this, Seth?" the sheriff asked, His voice strained. "The meaning," Seth said, his voice carrying over the crowd, "is that this man brought a private army to my home to murder us. There are 7 dead men in that canyon who will testify to that. And now, she has something to say." All eyes turned to Maria. She dismounted, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was her moment. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down. She walked over to Green, who stared at her with pure loathing. She took the pistol from her belt and held it steady, aimed not at his head, but at his heart. She turned to the crowd, to the faces of the men and women who had watched her being sold, who had averted their eyes, who had muttered their contempt. "My name is Maria," she began, her voice shaking at first, then growing stronger with every word. "And I was not born to be property. I was born in a place with a name, to a father who loved me. And I was sold. Not once, but 3 times. The last time was here, in this square." She looked around the crowd, her gaze lingering on the faces she recognized. "I remember you," she said, her eyes finding the rancher who had made the first bid. "And you," she said, looking at the preacher who had wanted to save her soul for $30. "You watched. You all watched. You watched as I was chained and paraded like an animal. You listened as men bid for my body, for the right to use me and break me. You called it a transaction. You called it business, but you knew what it was. You were buying a piece of a person's soul." A profound, uncomfortable silence fell over the crowd. Men shuffled their feet. Women looked down at the ground. "This man," she said, gesturing with the pistol toward Green, "did not invent this evil, but he perfected it. He built his gilded cage on the bones of girls like me. He grew rich on our tears and our shame. And when one single man, stood up and said no more, he tried to have him killed. He sent men to our home to drag me back here, to finish the job of breaking me. But he failed, because I am not broken, and I am not his." She turned the full force of her gaze back to Green, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "You do not own me. You do not own anyone. You are nothing but a coward who hides behind his money and his hired guns." She lowered the pistol. Her speech was done. She had not screamed or wept. She had simply spoken the truth, a truth so powerful it seemed to alter the very air in the square. Seth looked at Sheriff Thorne. The sheriff's face was pale, his eyes wide. The entire town was watching him, waiting. The balance of power had shifted. Green's aura of invincibility was gone, shattered by a lone man and a woman who refused to be a victim. "Sheriff," Seth said, his voice quiet but firm, "you said you were one man with one badge. Well, now you have testimony. You have bodies, and you have a whole town as witnesses. Do your job." For a long, agonizing moment, the sheriff stood frozen. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to pull in all the courage he possessed, he drew his pistol and walked toward Otis Green. "Otis Green," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The sheriff, for the first time in anyone's memory, had chosen the law over the man who paid his salary. Green's men, who had been watching from the saloon, made no move to intervene. Their power was derived from Green's, and his was now gone. The days that followed were strange. The town seemed to be holding its breath, unsure of how to exist without the shadow of Green looming over it. Some people, like the blacksmith, gave Seth a quiet, approving nod when he passed. The general store owner, Silas, offered him a sack of coffee on the house, an apology in his eyes. Other people still crossed the street to avoid them, their fear and prejudice a deeply ingrained habit. But no one challenged them. No one stared at Maria with contempt. When they looked at her now, they saw not a piece of property, but the woman who had faced down Otis Green with a gun in her hand and the truth on her tongue. One night, weeks later, a gentle rain began to fall, a soft, steady drumming on the roof of the cabin, washing the dust from the air. A fire crackled in the hearth. Maria stood before the small, cracked mirror on the wall. She was wearing the red dress, the one he had cleaned and she had mended. She looked at her reflection. She saw the face of a woman with scars, both visible and hidden. She saw the strength in her own eyes. There were no chains on her wrists. There was no fear in her heart. The cabin door opened, and Seth came in, shaking the rain from his hat. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the dress, and then at her face. The air in the room was thick with everything they had been through, with all the words that still remained unspoken. She turned from the mirror to face him. A small smile touched her lips. "I do not belong to you," she said, her voice soft but clear. It was not a challenge, but a statement of fact, a declaration of her own hard-won freedom. He walked toward her, his boots silent on the wooden floor. He stopped in front of her, his expression serious, his eyes full of a deep, quiet emotion. "No," he answered, his voice a low rumble. "You do not, but you still chose to stay." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, unshakable connection. It was a kiss that acknowledged their shared past and promised a shared future. When they broke apart, she reached up and unclasped the silver locket from her neck. She walked over to the small table beside his cot and laid it down gently. It was a beautiful thing, but it was part of his past, a story that was not hers. They would build their own story now. The final scene is not of a cabin or a town, but of a wide, open sky the color of a robin's egg. Seth and Maria ride side by side, their horses moving at an easy, unhurried pace. They are not riding away from anything. They are simply riding. The land around them is vast and empty and full of promise. They are not free from their scars. Those they will carry forever. But as they ride on together under that endless western sky, they are, at long last, free from fear. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.